just checking the autofocus thing. watch. Okay. How do I want to start? I have a project that I've kind of been working off and on, and that's kind of to educate myself on political stuff. I just decided to start somewhere, and that somewhere seems to be like with communism. Doesn't have to be the, you know, end of my studies. I've studied capitalism way more than communism. It's something that I've wanted to study and haven't really studied much. So I'm trying to read through. Why does my camera keep doing that? It's like it does this pulsing thing, like as it's trying to focus. I was going to read chronologically through all of Marx, like everything that he's written, and try to actually understand it, because I've tried to just jump into like Das Kapital, and then I didn't understand any of it. So instead, what I'm trying to do is kind of look at his stuff chronologically, and even then, it's like really dense, and you have to read it really carefully. So what I'm doing is I'm going through this sentence by sentence and translating it to a level that I can understand. So far, I'm on paragraph 5, and even that's taken me like an hour just to get that far. Okay, what does he say? We must therefore seriously examine whether we have really been inspired in our choice of a profession, whether an inner voice approves of it, or whether this inspiration is a delusion, and what we took to be a call from the deity was self-deception. But how can we recognize this except by tracing the source of the inspiration itself? I translated that to you need to figure out whether an instinct or desire is genuinely from your innermost motivation, or if you're deluding yourself into something that is baseless. You can probably track down where that instinct is coming from. What is great glitters. Its glitter arouses ambition, and ambition can easily have produced the inspiration, or what we took for inspiration. But reason can no longer restrain the man who is tempted by the demon of ambition, and he plunges headlong into what impetuous instinct suggests. He no longer chooses his position in life, instead is determined by chance and illusion. Okay. Potential, personal, excellence, power, esteem. Potential personal excellence, power, esteem, and etc. is a shiny, shiny object that can obscure our more careful, deliberate ability to walk through a decision. If you try to follow ambition, you're going to end up aimlessly wandering around from one vaporous potential for fame and fortune to another. So reading this like early on, Marx was a deist. I think he became like a not deist later on in his life. All right, I'm bored with this. I managed to pick up on where I left off. My back hurts. It's because I'm not sitting attentively. Alright, so left off reading about theory ladenness. Okay, so let's read through this because it seems like it's related to the scientific paradigm thingy. Theory ladenness. In philosophy of science, shouldn't it be in the philosophy of science? What is it? Why does my camera like pulse? It's weird. It's like it does this thing where it zooms in and then out really quickly. But like only by like a small degree. Does it have to do with, I think it has to do with like whether my phone is moving or not. Because I'm filming this on my phone. In philosophy of science, an observation is said to be theory-laden when shaped by the investigator's theoretical presuppositions. Okay. So theory-ladenness is when you're assuming. When you're assuming stuff and you're kind of burdened by that. Or an observation is said to be theory-laden. So your observations are affected by your assumptions. So you're going into it with presuppositions. Okay, that makes sense. According to this perspective, observers have a perspective that presupposes a theory. There should be like, I think there's a missing word in there. According to this perspective, when observers have a perspective that presupposes a theory, no, it's making a statement. According to this perspective, observers have According to this perspective, observers have a perspective that's presupposed. According to this perspective, observers have a perspective that presupposes a theory. They inevitably make judgments about the observed information at the moment of observation. The thesis is chiefly associated with the late 1950s, early 1960s work of Norwood, Russell Hanson, Thomas Kuhn, and Paul Feyerabend, though it was most likely put forth some 50 years earlier, at least implicitly, by Pierre Duhem. Semantic theory-latedness refers to the impact of theoretical assumptions on the meaning of observational terms, while perceptual theory-latedness refers to the impact on perceptual existence itself. Did I say that right? Semantic theory-latedness refers to the theoretical assumptions on the meaning of observational terms, while perceptual theory-latedness refers to their impact on the perceptual experience itself. Well, duh. Theory-latedness is also relevant for measurement outcomes. Wait, you're changing the subject. Let's go back to perceptual experience. So, perceptual theory-latedness. What does that mean? Theoretical it's like they have this ambiguous noun there. Alright, so perceptual theory-latedness refers to the impact of theoretical assumptions on the perceptual experience itself. I'm doing the mind blanking thing. Like when I've read something and it doesn't just. So I end up having to read it multiple times until it actually starts to make sense. Can you expand on that? Perceptual theory-latedness refers to the impact of theoretical assumptions. So you've got theoretical assumptions. Those theoretical assumptions have an impact on your actual perception of things. Okay, so that makes sense. So if you're assuming that the sky is green, you're going to look at the sky and it's going to be a color that's not green, and you're going to say, well, clearly blue is what green actually means. Well, no, because that would be semantic. It's more like you see something that you're assuming is going to be one thing, and if it's another, you're immediately affected by that presupposition, right? So if I say, yeah, the sky is green, and I look at the sky and it's not green, you're going to be like, sleepy again. they talk more about it later on, so maybe I can shelve this. Alright, so you go into it with one assumption, the perception hits, right? And your perception is colored by that presupposition. So you look at the sky, it's blue. We go, well, maybe it's kind of greenish, you know? Like you want to see something, or you're assuming something is going to be one thing, and it's not. But you're still really wanting to believe that it is that first thing, or that there's some presupposition, so you're just ignoring what you're seeing because you want to see something else. Theory-latedness is also relevant for measurement outcomes. The data thus acquired can said to be theory-laden since it is meaningless by itself unless interpreted as the outcome of the measurement processes involved. So you're making measurements and you're making presuppositions about how you're making the measurements. So you think your measurements are accurate, you know, because you're saying, well, of course what I'm measuring is accurate because I'm measuring distance, but it turns out you're not measuring distance, you're measuring something else like weight. You know, so your presuppositions about the measurements are wrong. So you say, I have 12 feet, and it turns out you have 12 pounds. You're making a presupposition about your measurement, and your presupposition about your measurement is wrong. Theory-latedness poses a problem for the confirmation of scientific theories, since the observational evidence may already implicitly presuppose the thesis it's supposed to justify. Okay, that makes sense. So you got string theory versus gravitational field theory. It says theory-latedness poses a problem for the confirmation of scientific theory since the observational evidence may already implicitly presuppose the thesis it's supposed to justify. This effect can present a challenge for reaching scientific consensus if the disagreeing parties make different observations due to their different theoretical backgrounds. Makes sense. This is not a long article, so it's good. Forms. Two forms of theory-latedness should be kept separate. The semantic form, the meaning of observational terms, which is determined by theoretical presuppositions, and B, the perceptual form, the theories held by the investigator at the basic cognitive level impinge on the perceptions of the investigator. So we're not talking perceptual level, we're talking cognitive level that affect your perceptions. So it's basically the disconnect or connect between, you know, the cognitive dissonance between what you're observing and what you've thought you were going to observe. The former may be referred to as semantic and the latter as perceptual theory-latedness. Well, yeah. In a book showing the theory-latedness of psychiatric evidences, it should just be evidence. There's no reason to have the evidences. I hear evidences when you've got like creationist crazies talking about stuff. They're like, all right, we got evidences, and it's like, you haven't even gotten one evidence. It's bold of you to assume that you've got more than one. In a book showing the theory-latedness of psychiatric evidences. Okay, so we're talking about a specific field. I keep getting like hangnails. It's too dark in here to really start working on it though. I don't know how to make the hangnails stop being there. Did I finish reading that sentence? I don't think I did. In a book showing the theory-latedness of psychiatric evidences, so that particular field of psychiatry, Massimiliano Aragona in Il Mito dei Fatti. You're not going to bother translating this? The myth of facts. Interesting. Distinguish three forms of theory-latedness. Are you not going to go through all three of them? They've got this. The weak form was already affirmed by Karl Popper. It is weak because he maintains the idea of theoretical progress directed to the truth of scientific theories. What? The weak form of psychiatric theory-latedness is weak because Popper maintains the idea of theoretical progress directed to the truth of scientific theories. What does that mean? You need to elaborate on that. You can't just say that. Alright, so Popper said the idea of theoretical progress, yet that's not a complete sentence. The idea of theoretical progress directed to the truth of scientific theories. What? See, this is why it's hard for me to understand, like, even basic stuff, because when you get to the basic stuff, it's like this. And this is how it's expressed. This is how it's explained. Which is poorly. It's like you've got Wikipedia saying, we want you to make things concise and easily understandable. No. They want things to be concise over the understandability of something. Alright, so are you saying that theory latedness is weak when theoretical progress has a direction to science? Is that what you're saying? So, like, in other words, the more something is grounded in scientific reality, the less the theory latedness is. Because that would make sense to me. Alright, so the strong form of theory latedness was sustained by Kuhn and Feyerabend with their notion of incommensurability. Incommensurability is if they are embedded in starkly contrasting conceptual frameworks whose languages do not overlap sufficiently to permit scientists to directly compare the theories or cite empirical evidence favoring one theory over another. So string theory people have one set of terminology, gravitational field people have another set of terminology, and they're incommensurable because their terminology doesn't even overlap. We're not talking about the theories overlapping, we're talking about the language itself not overlapping. I don't think I need to read that. I think this summary is sufficient. Like, I don't think I really need to go much more into this. This article hasn't been revised since like 2023. So you can't really blame me for not understanding certain things when Wikipedia hasn't straightened these things out. Wikipedia is the central repository of all human knowledge. This is where things go to be verified. I'm getting a haircut soon. I need to schedule the haircut. In order to book a haircut thing, I need to stop the recording. Nobody's watching it anyway, though. So maybe I'll just do that like later. However, Kuhn was a moderate relativist and maintained the Kantian view that although reality is not directly knowable, in other words, the whole we live in a simulation kind of a thing, it manifests itself resisting to our interpretations. Do I have a hangnail here too? I'm gonna start putting my grocery list together. Get some kale, some potassium. I will literally have 3-year supply of potassium if I get this. Don't think I need Brussels sprouts just yet. Probably should get them though. Okay, so what does this strong form have to do with it? Because they don't explain it very well. Okay, so strong form of theory-latedness, meaning... Like, I'm assuming that everybody else has read this, that, like, has an electronics mastery degree, you know. They go into, like, the Kantian stuff, like, with, having to do with Kuhn and Feyerabend. They study this too, right? I have to do these things in order for stuff to make sense. Okay, so the strong form of theory-latedness is sustained by Kuhn and Feyerabend with their notion of non-shared language. So they're saying because the language is not shared, because it's incommensurable, that means that it's heavily theory laden. Like it's strongly theory laden. That makes sense. However, Kuhn was a moderate relativist, citation needed, and maintained the Kantian view that although reality is not directly knowable, it manifests itself resisting our interpretations. So basically he's saying, yeah, you know what, you can try your little we live in a simulation thing, but that's going to kind of run into reality pushing back against that. It's like, we live in a simulation. Reality is like, no, we're not. You moron. You can directly see stuff that contradicts that, you know. But they're saying here that that doesn't work. Because it doesn't necessarily disprove that, you know. On the contrary, Feyerabend completely reversed the relationship between observations and theories, introducing an extra strong form of theory ladenness in which anything goes. So theories are more important than observations, I think is what they're saying, which means that theory ladenness is stronger. So the stronger the theory ladenness is, the weaker observational stuff is. Measurement outcomes. Van Frossen distinguishes between observations, phenomena, observed entities. So observations, you making the observation or the measurement. Phenomena, which is the observed thing, and appearances, the contents of measurement outcomes. In other words, what those observations meant. So an example of an appearance is the temperature of 38 degrees Celsius of a patient as measured using a thermometer. The number 38 is meaningless by itself unless we interpret it as the outcome of a measurement process. Makes sense. Such an interpretation implicitly assumes other various theses about how the thermometer is used, how the thermometers work, etc. So there's other theses that go into that one observation. So it's an observation made of other observations. All appearances are theory laden in this sense. So the contents of measurement outcomes. So you're saying measurements are dependent on a lot of other things backing it up. But in many cases, this does not pose serious practical problems as long as the presumed theses are either correct or only contain mistakes relevant to the intended application. So as long as they're correct, who cares? Or only contain mistakes irrelevant to the intended application. It's like, okay, it has mistakes in it, but those mistakes aren't important in this specific context. Theory ladenness this is particularly relevant for the problem of confirmation of scientific theories. Well, yeah. According to the scientific method, methods, observational evidence is needed to develop scientific theories and to test their predictions. So it's empirical. But if an observation is theory-laden, then it already presumes various theses and therefore cannot act as a neutral arbitrator between theories, which I'm just reading this without actually thinking about it. But if an observation is theory-laden, then it already implicitly presumes, but if an observation is theory-laden, then it already implicitly presumes the various theses, and therefore cannot act as a neutral arbitrator between theories which affirm or deny the presumed theses. This is akin to the informal fallacy of begging the question. So what they're trying to say is you've got a theory-laden observation, right? So like the appearance of, you've got the observation of a measurement, right? And you're assuming things about it. No, that's a bad thing. But if an observation is theory-laden, then it already implicitly presumes various theses. Okay, so what you want is an observation that is not theory-laden. You want the theory-ladenness to be very weak. But the problem is when an observation, and that's not an if, it's a when an observation is theory-laden, then it already presumes various theses. But if an observation is theory-laden, then it already presumes various theses and cannot act as a neutral arbitrator between theories which affirm or deny the presumed theses. Okay, I think I get it. So you've got a theory that's dependent on other theories, and that theory can't act as an arbitrator between two theories. So here's your one theory, right? It's dependent on these two theories. There's a third theory that these two are trying to argue between. So you can't use this one to argue between these two. You need to argue what's down here rather than what's up here, because this is dependent on these. Problems with scientific consensus. Theory-ladenness also poses problems for scientific consensus. Different researchers may initially hold different background beliefs. Ideally, the observations they make in the course of their research would enable... I used to be playing Civ 3 and then I got away from that, and I had to get away from it because I had other things that I needed to do, but I want to go back to doing it. There's so many different things I want to do, and very few of them are work. So I'm trying to get out of work by doing this. Like by educating myself so that I don't have to go back to that job. But it's like so difficult. Theory ladeness also poses problems for scientific consensus. Different researchers may initially hold different background beliefs. Ideally, emphasis on ideally the observations they make in the course of their research would enable each of them to discern which of those beliefs are false. So they would eventually reach an agreement on the central issues. But their different background beliefs may cause them to make different observations despite the fact that they both observe the same phenomena. In such a case, the disagreement happens not just on the level of supported theories, but also on the level of supporting observational evidence that is supposed to arbitrate between the theories. Under those circumstances, gathering more theory-laden evidence would only deepen the problem instead of solving it. So you want to get stuff that doesn't depend on theory. You want stuff that depends on observation as much as possible. The problem of unresolved disagreements is more severe in the social sciences and philosophy than in the natural sciences. For example, disagreements in ethics or in metaphysics often end in a clash of the brute intuitions, which act as evidence for or against the competing theories. But it is an open question as to which extent these disagreements are due to theory lateness or other factors. So, stop judging me so harshly if I'm stupid about something when you haven't even figured out your basic things that your entire science depends on. Like, you're like, well, we gotta just drill down and refine the science and stuff, and it's like, yes, but once you get some kind of a scientific and philosophical and psychiatric and social consensus on things, then you can come back to me and say how bad my grades are. But until then, you are failing in your homework because you have not completed the assignment. I'm trying to see what it takes to make this camera lose focus and do the doo-doo thing. Alright, so we've managed to finish this article somehow. We're reading about the scientific paradigm. Alright. Drawing on Norwood Russell Hanson's discussion of theory ladenness, Kuhn used the expression paradigm shift, see below, for this process. And liken it to the perceptual change that occurs when an interpretation of an ambiguous image flips over from one state to another. That makes sense. The rabbit duck illusion is an example. It is not possible to see both the rabbit and the duck simultaneously. If you say so. I mean, you can look at it as just a line. If you have two of the same drawing next to each other, then you can see one is one and the other is another. This is significant in relation to the notion of, or the issue of incommensurability, see below. So you've got this incompatible thingy, like incompatible language, and you've got a paradigm shift that's happening between these two things that are incommensurable. An example of the currently accepted paradigm would be the standard model of physics. The scientific method allows for orthodox scientific investigations into phenomena that might contradict or disprove the standard model. However, grant funding would be proportionally more difficult to obtain for such experiments, depending on the degree of deviation from the accepted standard model theory the experiment would test for. For example, an experiment to test for the mass of neutrinos or the decay of protons, small departures from the model, is more likely to receive, than experiments that look for the violation of conservation of momentum or ways to engineer reverse time travel. Yeah, I get it. Mechanisms similar to the original Kuhnian paradigm have been, what's the Kuhnian paradigm again? So the Kuhnian paradigm is between normal science and revolution, where you've got two different paradigms happening. I'm just going to keep fussing over these things until I actually do something about it. Alright, so the Kuhnian thing is they're making this way more complicated than it needs to be. Like, they need to just be explaining this stuff in plain language. How long is this article? This article is really, really long. Mechanisms similar to the original Kuhnian paradigm have been invoked in various disciplines other than the philosophy of science. These include the idea of major cultural themes, worldviews, ideologies, and mindsets. Okay. They have somewhat similar meanings that apply to smaller and larger scale examples of disciplined thought. In addition, Michael Foucault used the terms episteme? How do you pronounce this? Episteme. Episteme. How do you pronounce it? Okay, so in addition, Michael Foucault used the terms episteme, and discourse mathesis. Mathesis? Mathesis. Mathesis. So math theses. And taxonomia for aspects of a paradigm in Kuhn's original sense. Do I want to just stop here? I'm laughing at the quote from Lord Kelvin. In The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Kuhn wrote that the successive transition from one paradigm to another via revolution is the usual developmental pattern of mature science. Paradigm shifts tend to appear in response to the accumulation of critical anomalies, as well as in the form of the proof. Paradigm shifts tend to appear in response to the accumulation of critical anomalies, as well as in the form of the proposal of a new theory with the power to encompass both older relevant data and explain relevant anomalies. New paradigms tend to be the most dramatic in sciences that appear to be the most stable and mature, as in physics at the end of the 19th century. At that time, a statement generally attributed to physicist Lord Kelvin famously claimed, "There is nothing new to be discovered in physics now. All that remains is more and more precise measurement." 5 years later, Albert Einstein published his paper on special relativity, which challenged the set of rules laid down by Newtonian mechanics, which had been used to describe force and motion for over 200 years. In this case, the new paradigm reduces the old to a special case in the sense that Newtonian mechanics is still a good model for approximation for speeds that are slow compared to the speed of light. Philosophers and historians of science, including Kuhn himself, ultimately accepted a modified version of Kuhn's model. By the way, this whole sentence here, citation needed at the bottom. Ultimately accepted a modified version of Kuhn's model, which synthesizes his original view with the gradualist model that preceded it. What? Well, Kuhn's model was revolution. Then there's the gradualist thing. Kuhn's original model is now seen as too limited. We don't really know what Kuhn's model is without reading thoroughly into Kuhn. How do you pronounce Kuhn? Kuhn. Yeah. O is in goose. Or U:. Huh, it's from Cincinnati. Interesting. Yeah, P hacking. Data dredging. Let's read the article. Some examples of contemporary paradigm shifts include, in medicine, the transition from clinical judgment to evidence-based medicine. Well, duh. In social psychology, the transition from p-hacking to replication. So p-hacking is like when you have something that's supposedly relevant to another thingy, but it's not. It's just, and the example that they give is number of letters in the winning word of a script spelling bee versus number of people killed by venomous spiders, and there's like a correlation there, like between the two. So it's correlation versus causation, and in social psychology, the transition from p-hacking to replication. So you're simply trying to replicate a result. In software engineering, the transition from the rational paradigm to the empirical paradigm. I don't know what that means. In artificial intelligence, the transition from classical AI to data-driven AI. Kuhn's idea was itself revolutionary in its time. It caused a major change in the way that academics talk about science, and so it may be that it caused or was part of a paradigm shift in the history of sociology of science, and in the history and sociology of science. However, Kuhn would not recognize such a paradigm shift. Being in the social sciences, people can still use earlier ideas to discuss the history of science. Paradigm paralysis. Perhaps the greatest barrier to paradigm shift in some cases is the reality of a paradigm paralysis, the inability or refusal to see beyond the current models of thinking. This is similar to what psychologists term confirmation bias and the Semmelweis reflex. Oh no, we're going to be reading about this now. The Semmelweis reflex, or the Semmelweis effect, is a metaphor for the reflex-like tendency to reject new evidence or new knowledge because it contradicts norms, beliefs, or paradigms. Well, that's the same thing as confirmation bias, as far as I'm concerned. I don't need to read more into that, I don't think. Which in itself is kind of a Semmelweis reflexing. Yada yada yada. So he was the guy that said, interesting. Yeah, I mean, you can go further into what that entails. I need to be not waking up my roommate. Kuhn pointed out that it can be difficult. Wait, I didn't finish reading this. This is similar to what happened. Examples include the rejection of Aristarchus of Samos. Who's Aristarchus? Copernicus and Galileo's theory of a heliocentric solar system, discovery of electrostatic photography, xerography, dry photocopying technique, and the quartz clock. Huh. Interesting. Wow. One of the two. So they did a demonstration on TV, and one of the two copiers caught fire. I'm now reading about the Pentagon Papers. Interesting. Huh. So the whole point of the Vietnam War was to contain China. It's really a shame that China supports Russia instead of Ukraine. Alright, so what were we reading about? What did that even have to do with xerography? Because they were like, well, they laughed at the man who invented xerography, and it's like, doesn't look like it. Looks like it was a commercial success. Do I have to keep reading this? Because I'm bored. That's the problem. It seems like all I'm doing is like reading through semantical things, not really learning anything. Like, it's important to understand what it is that they're saying. Kind of. But it's not really teaching me anything like about electronics and stuff. I mean, learning about this will help me keep from becoming lost, you know? When it's just like, I have no idea what you're talking about, you're using all this terminology. This will help me keep from that happening. I'm installing the update to LT Spice. Oops. Alright, Kuhn pointed out that it can be difficult to assess whether a particular paradigm shift had actually led to progress in the sense of explaining more facts, etc. Right. Explaining more important facts or providing better explanations because the understanding of those more important and better changed with the paradigm. So those two versions of reality are incommensurable. In other words, you're saying better and stuff, but the problem is that you can't even say that because the paradigm's changed so much. Like your worldview has been altered, so you can't say like, alright, say you're Buddhist and stuff, and you go, such and such is a better form of Buddhism than this form of Buddhism. But then you convert to like Celtic stuff, you know, and what you said before about Buddhism, about more, better, can't even be applied to Celticism, Celtic, Druidicism, because they're so radically different. Like, they're just not even the same thing, so you can't say better or anything. The two versions of reality are thus incommensurable. Kuhn's version of incommensurability has an important psychological dimension. This is apparent from his analogy between a paradigm shift and the flip-over involved in some optical illusion. However, he subsequently diluted his commitment to incommensurability considerably, particularly in the light of other studies of scientific development that did not involve revolutionary change. One of the examples of incommensurability that Kuhn used was the change in the style of chemical investigations that followed the work of Lavoisier on atomic theory in the late 18th century. In this change, the focus had shifted from the bulk of properties of matter, such as hardness, color, reactivity, etc., to studies of atomic weights and quantitative studies of reactions. Couldn't you have just said like Kuhn instead of like he, because like we don't know if it's Lavoisier or Kuhn that's saying this. He suggested that it was impossible to make the comparison needed to judge which body of knowledge was better or more advanced. However, this change in research style and the comparison needed to judge which body of knowledge was better or more... Nope, I skipped to the previous line instead of going to the next one. This change in research style and paradigm eventually, after more than a century, led to the theory of atomic structure that accounts well for the bulk of properties of matter. See, for example, Brady's general chemistry. According to P.J. Smith, this ability of science to back off, move sideways, and then advance is characteristic of the natural sciences, but contrasts with position in some social sciences, notably economics. Well, yeah, economics is a social science, so... I think at the 2-hour mark I'm going to stop recording and stuff, or at least shift my focus of recording. I want to get like buzz cut on the side, graduating into this, try to keep some of the curl, but it is like an inch long on all sides, and the beard is getting really out there, and it just kind of, like, this is how long it is. Like, that's how far away from my face it is. It's just because it's so curly that it, like, looks like it's this, but actually it's like this, which is pretty amazing. It's just because it's really curly. So, frick economics, like, it doesn't even matter. Like, who cares? That's just somebody doing insider trading, it doesn't really have anything to do with science. So I get what they're saying. It's like, all right, look, if you move back, take a step back and analyze things, you're actually providing a better way of measuring those previous traits. So you take a step back from alchemy, you study chemistry, you go back into explaining stuff that you learned during alchemy. Echo, what time is sunrise?
Sunrise in Greymore, Devondale will be at 7:25 a.m. today.
It's a long time from now. The apparent ability does not guarantee that the account is vertical? Veridical. At any one time, of course. So in other words, wait, what does veridical mean? Truthful. Coinciding with reality. Most modern philosophers of science are fallibilists. That kind of makes sense. So all it means is that you're liable to error. This whole thing is an exercise in me just talking to myself. Am I really that bad company though? So it's kind of iffy truth, I guess we'll call it. However, members of other disciplines do see the key issue of incommensurability as a much greater obstacle to evaluations of progress. See, for example, Martin Slattery's Key Ideas in Sociology. Opaque Kuhnian paradigms. What do you mean opaque? Opaque Kuhnian paradigms and paradigm shifts do exist. A few years after the discovery of mirror neurons that provide a hardwired basis for the human capacity for empathy, the scientists involved were unable to identify the incidents that had directed their attention to the issue. course of the investigation, their language and metaphors changed so that they themselves could no longer interpret all of their own laboratory notes and records. That is crazy. So their terminology changed over the course of the investigation, so much that they couldn't even keep track of their own lab notes. So I would guess that they would have to redo that experiment. Emery Lakatos. How do you pronounce that? Lakatos. So it depends on if it's the Lakatos. Lakatos. Emery Lakatos. Or in the US it's O. Lakatos. Emery Lakatos suggested as an alternative to Kuhn's formulation that scientists actually work within research programs, which is crazy. A research program, in Lakatos's sense, a research program is a sequence of problems placed in order of priority. The set of priorities and the associated set of preferred techniques is the positive heuristic. How do you pronounce heuristic? Heuristic is the positive heuristic of a program. Each program has a negative heuristic. Also has a negative heuristic. This consists of a set of fundamental assumptions that, temporarily at least, takes priority over observational evidence when the two appear to conflict. So you take a measurement and you go, this can't be right. This measurement can't be right. We have our own pre-existing negative heuristic that overrides it. And then a positive heuristic would be, yes, the numbers are off the scale because he simply is that powerful. This latter aspect of research programs is inherited from Kuhn's work on paradigms and represents an important departure from the elementary account of how science works. According to this, science proceeds through repeated cycles of observation, induction, hypothesis testing, etc., with the test of consistency with empirical evidence being opposed at each stage. Paradigms in research programs allow anomalies to be set aside, where there is reason to believe that they arise from incomplete knowledge about either the substantive topic or some aspect of the theories used in making observations. What? Okay, so that makes sense. It's kind of just let's set this to the side. and continue with the research for now. Larry Loudon. Larry Loudon. Dormant anomalies, fading credibility, and research traditions. Larry Loudon has also made two important contributions to the debate. Loudon believed that something akin to paradigms exist in the social sciences. Kuhn had contested this, see below. He referred to these as research traditions. Loudon noted that some anomalies become dormant if they survive a long period during which no competing alternatives has shown itself capable of resolving the anomaly. He also presented cases in which a dominant paradigm had withered away because it's lost credibility when viewed against changes in the wider intellectual milieu. Yep. He also presented cases in which the dominant paradigm withered away because it's lost credibility when viewed against changes in the wider. Kuhn himself did not consider the concept of paradigm as appropriate for the social sciences. He explains in this preface to The Structure of Scientific Revolutions that he developed... Wait, I'm not done reading this previous paragraph. So, some kind of traditional theory gets so segmented within such a broad range of like the greater intellectual milieu that it just kind of fades to obscurity. It's like the ether kind of theory, It's discredited or because it's just so many other things advanced while that thing stayed static. Maybe I ought to try a new barber. I'm not going to get a haircut until tomorrow, I think. Am I almost done reading this? No. I'm really losing interest in this. Because a lot of this has to do with social sciences. I don't know. Isn't this important to learn this thing, like learn about paradigms in order to know what people are talking about so it's not just a buzzword? He himself did not consider the concept of paradigm as appropriate for the social sciences. He explains in his preface to The Structure of Scientific Revolutions that he developed the concept of paradigm precisely to distinguish the social from the natural sciences. Interesting. While visiting the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, where's Stanford, Connecticut? California. Really? I thought Stanford was in Connecticut. Yeah, it is. Stamford. So there's Stanford and Stamford. Huh. I didn't realize that was a thing. I always just conflated the two. Surrounded by social scientists, he observed that they were never in agreement about the legitimate scientific problems and methods. He explains that he wrote this book to precisely show that there can never be any paradigms in the social sciences because they're so widely disparate. Matthieu Dogen, a French sociologist, in his article Paradigms in the Social Sciences, develops Kuhn's original thesis that there are no paradigms at all in social sciences since the concepts are polysemic. The capacity for a sign to have multiple related meanings. Involving the deliberate mutual ignorance between scholars and the proliferation of schools within these disciplines. Dogen provides many examples of the non-existence of paradigms in the social sciences in his essay, particularly in sociology, political science, and political anthropology. So basically he's saying because right now, at least, paradigms are so disparate and there's so many of them that there pretty much aren't any paradigms. There is no common consensus in the social sciences right now. However, both Kuhn's original work and Dogen's commentary are directed to disciplines that are defined by conventional labels, such as sociology. While it is true that such broad groupings in the social sciences are usually not based on a Kuhnian paradigm, each of the competing subdisciplines may still be underpinned by a paradigm research program, research tradition, or professional imagery. These structures will be motivating research, providing it with an agenda, defining what is and is not anomalous evidence, and inhibiting debate with other groups that fall under the same broad disciplinary label. A good example is provided by the contrast between Skinnerian radical behaviorism and personal construct theory within psychology. I'm going to pause. I'm not going to look at that stuff just yet. The most significant of the many ways these two subdisciplines of psychology differ concerns meanings and intentions. In PCT, they are seen as the central concern of psychology. In radical behaviorism, they are not scientific evidence at all, as they cannot be directly observed. So yeah, PCT, personal construct theory, says that meanings and intentions can be observed. Skinnerian radical behaviorism says that they cannot be observed. I've talked with my therapist about this before, which is that, you know, if you look at the school of the law school, like they're going to say, yeah, actually, you can kind of sort of gauge people's intentions and stuff. There's a whole school of thought surrounding it, and there's laws and stuff surrounding it, and there's a whole body of cases and precedents and stuff surrounding like meanings and intentions. Such considerations explain the conflict between the Kuhn-Dogen view and the views of others, including Larry Loudon, see above, who do apply these concepts to social sciences. Honda ML in 1986 introduced the idea of a social paradigm within the context of social sciences. He identified the basic components of a social paradigm. Like Kuhn, Honda addressed the issue of changing paradigm, the process popularly known as paradigm shift. In this respect, he focused on social circumstances that precipitate such a shift and the effects of the shift on social institutions, including the institution of education. The broad shift in the social arena, in turn, changes the way the individual perceives reality. Well, yeah, I mean, if your culture is different, you're going to perceive things differently. Another use of the word paradigm in the sense of worldview. Another use of the word paradigm is in the sense of worldview. For example, in social science, the term is used, I use it synonymously. For example, in social science, the term is used to describe the set of experiences, beliefs, and values that affect the way an individual perceives reality in response to that perception. Social sciences have adopted the Kuhnian phrase paradigm shift to denote a change in how a given society goes about organizing and understanding reality. A dominant paradigm refers to the values or system of thought in a society that are most standard and widely held at a given time. Well, yeah, I mean, you can kind of measure those. People do it in polls all the time. Dominant paradigms are shaped by both the community's cultural background and by the context of the historical moment. Hutchin outlines some conditions that facilitate a system of thought to become an accepted dominant paradigm. Professional organizations that give legitimacy to the paradigm, dynamic leaders who introduce and purport the paradigm, journals and editors who write about the system of thought. They both disseminate the information essential to the paradigm and give the paradigm legitimacy. Government agencies who give credence to the paradigm. Educators who, so you got authoritative or authority appeals to authority in there. Educators who propagate the paradigm's ideas and teach it by teaching it to students. Conferences conducted that are devoted to discussing ideas central to the paradigm. Media coverage, lay groups or groups based around the concerns of laypersons that embrace the beliefs central to the paradigm, and sources of funding to further research on the paradigm. Do I want to read this article or this next set of 3 paragraphs? I've got 3 minutes to do it. I'll stop at 3 minutes. 3 minutes in. Other uses. The word paradigm is also used to indicate a pattern or model of, or an extendingly clear or typical example or archetype. Like a paragon. The term is frequently used in this sense in the design professions. Design paradigms or archetypes can comprise functional precedences for design solutions. The best known references on design paradigms are Design Paradigms, a sourcebook for creative visualization by Wake, and Design Paradigms by Petrosky. 16-page long thing. Well, fine then. Don't show me. It's also used. The term paradigm is also used in cybernetics. Here, okay, so we're not talking about like Cyberdyne technologies, the Terminator thing. We're talking about cybernetics in recursive systems, like self-defining systems. Here it means, in a very wide sense, a conceptual proto-program for reducing the chaotic mass to some form of order. Note the similarities to the concept of entropy in chemistry and physics. A paradigm there would be a sort of prohibition to proceed with any action that would increase the total entropy in the system. What? So in other words, a paradigm in chemistry would be where you can't do anything without changing it. To create a paradigm requires a closed system that accepts changes. So a paradigm in chemistry can't exist because it can't accept changes. But a closed system paradigm can accept changes as long as it's not in its final stage. Okay. Beyond it, and we made it to the 2-hour mark. It took me 2 hours to read this article on the scientific paradigm. Beyond its use in physical, and we're still not done. I'm still got one more thing. Beyond its use in the physical and social sciences, Kuhn's paradigm has been analyzed in its relation to its applicability and identified in paradigms with respect to worldviews at specific points in history. One example is Matthew Edward Harris's book, The Notion of Papal Monarchy in the 13th Century, the idea of paradigm in church history. Harris stresses the primarily sociological importance of paradigms, pointing towards Kuhn's second edition of The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Although obedience to popes such as Innocent III and Boniface VIII was widespread, even written testimony from the time showing loyalty to the Pope does not demonstrate that the writer held the same worldview as the Church, and therefore Pope at the center. The difference between paradigms in physical sciences and in historical organizations such as the Church, is that the former, unlike the latter, requires technical expertise rather than repeating statements. In other words, after scientific training through what Kuhn calls exemplars, gonna have to look that up now. Okay, he's not gonna tell us. One could not genuinely believe that, to take a trivial example, the earth is flat, whereas thinkers such as Giles of Rome in the 13th century wrote in favor of the Pope. What? After scientific training through what Kuhn calls exemplars, so they don't even define that, one could genuinely believe that, to take a trivial example, one could not genuinely believe that, to take a trivial example, one could not genuinely believe that, to take a trivial example, the earth is flat, whereas thinkers such as Giles of Rome in the 13th century wrote in favor of the Pope, then could easily write similarly glowing things about the king. A writer such as Giles would have wanted a good job from the Pope. He was a papal publicist. However, Morris writes that scientific group membership is not concerned with desire, emotions, gain, loss, and any idealistic notions concerning the nature and destiny of humankind, but to simply do with aptitude, explanation, and cold description of the facts of the world and the universe from within a paradigm. I am totally lost in their example here. Yeah, their example doesn't make any sense. So Giles of Rome was just repeating stuff back. He wasn't necessarily genuinely believing these things, and he wasn't really doing anything other than that. He might have been a thinker, doing his own thinking and being like a kind of self-guided person, but he was still just repeating stuff because he had to. Okay. I think we're done with this article. I'm reading an article on triune continuum paradigm. to read about that just yet. So we are back to the introduction of quantum mechanics. Alright, I'm going to stop the video here and do something else.